Greetings, folks. So, some of the early questions I tend to get from people who are interested in the industry are what kinds of skills are employers looking for in order to basically get a job in the field? So, the following are my top choices for what I think is the most important to focus on when looking for jobs in the field, basically. So, number one is going to be experience doing audio and music composition design, basically. And so that's a pretty obvious one, and it's the kind of job, sort of the skill level that would, or the skill that would cover what you're just doing already for linear media like film, television, stuff like that. But you would probably do it in this case specifically for gameplay or potentially cutscenes or things like that. So you would basically rescore, or provision a game scene with your own sound effects that you either design yourself or that you obtained and tweaked and stuff like that. And the idea is to really blow people away with your reel and make that very, very impressive. So these kinds of skills are pretty basic. This is pretty much like what almost every employer is going to be treating as like the given, like in terms of like how good everything is. So they're going to assume that you already know how to do really amazing music, really amazing sound design, stuff like that. So that's number one. So next one is basically audio middleware. So audio middleware also has been around for a little while, and skills in terms of audio implementation, sometimes it's called technical sound design, anyway, things like that. But using tools like Audio Kinetics Wise or Fmod Studio, or perhaps Elias has got a thing, and there's also a middleware called CRI that's very popular in Japan. But especially Wise and Fmod are probably the most common ones out there. Your skills, your ability to deal with these kinds of things are going to be like paramount in terms of like, that's going to be one of the more important things that most employers are looking for, experience with these kinds of things. Now, all these tools are free to download. They're free to learn, stuff like that. And in the case of Wise, there is in fact a whole series of stuff that is available for students to be able to download a certification path effectively so that you can learn how to be good at the sound effects or just at the music or dealing with game engines and stuff like that. So, you can do all those kinds of things with those particular kinds of software. Fmod doesn't really have, it doesn't really have a certification path per se, but not to toot my own horn, but the Game Audio Institute has a lot of very cool Fmod-based projects that you can use to implement music and or sound effects. And so, you can avail yourself of those if you want to. And yeah, so, and, there's other ones that are available, but the Fmod and Wise, at least here in America anyway, are the most common ones to be able to find. So skills, with those kinds of things are going to show the employer that you have an idea of how to create complex sound behaviors inside a game and being able to do some pretty cool things with interactive and adaptive audio, which we can describe in other videos later on. So the third thing that I think in many respects is kind of the most important in this particular case is basically game engine experience as well as scripting experience. So basically having to understand what the game is actually doing in order to trigger events, I think is one of the most vital things. And I think that in many cases it's overlooked by many people, many schools that educate this kind of sort of stuff. They tend to spend a lot of time emphasizing the middleware, or possibly just even the sound design aspects and not much else. And really understanding how the game is going to trigger the event is absolutely vital. And that means understanding how game logic works inside a game and how programming flows work inside a game in general. I mean, not becoming an actual full-on programmer, but understanding enough about the scripting to be able to look through the code and find the part that's going to trigger, say, the footstep event or the door opening event or whatever kinds of other events you need to have happen. And in the case of game engines, there's two big ones that cover most of the market at this point in time. So the first engine that we're going to cover is the Unreal Engine. And the Unreal Engine is probably the most common engine that the AAA game industry uses if they're not already using their own internal in-house engine, sort of like EA does with Frostbite and stuff like that. The Unreal Engine just simply has a lot of power and a lot of scalability for a lot of different kinds of situations. So it's really big for those huge console and PC games franchises that are just, really, really that have a lot of involved infrastructure, if you will, and also the other thing that Unreal does very well is it has an excellent sort of look and feel to it, like a rendering that comes out of the box that just looks really ideal, essentially for a very high quality, high polished kind of look, essentially. So that's one of the main things about Unreal that's very powerful. The only thing that's not so good on Mac side generally, except until very recently, has been that Unreal has been a very fairly heavy graphics oriented engine and therefore requires a lot of graphics performance from the hardware. And up until recently, with the M1 Max and M1 Pro chips, they haven't really been able to come up to the speed required to be able to even work in the engine, relatively efficiently. So with these new chips, actually, it's now possible to develop using a Mac. However, there's certainly not very many Mac games out there, but that's a whole nother problem, basically. And as far as learning the game engine, of course, you can learn all the different parts of the game engine that, how to do things. And it's very good and advisable to do that. But you also need to learn how to trigger events inside the game and understand what's going on. And for Unreal, probably the most common way to do this is by using something called blueprints. And that is a visual scripting language. And a lot of people think that, hey, visual scripting is not really full-on programming, so I don't have to worry about understanding programming. I can just use visual scripting. And that's not really the case. You really do have to understand how programming flow works and how logic flow works inside a game. And honestly, doing that will help you be better at something like visual scripting with blueprints. In fact, blueprints is really quite a very powerful type of scripting language. And in fact, they hire people at AAA game companies just to be blueprints programmers. Anyway, so that's probably one of the things that, if you're going to deal with the Unreal Engine, then learn blueprints, and it's a pretty safe way to do things. There is also a programming aspect of learning C++ if you want to write your own blueprints nodes, and that is a certain skill that is well regarded and stuff like that, and that's a good kind of thing. I guess one thing to mention is that, that I've often mentioned to my students, who ask me if they need to know scripting and things like that, is no amount of scripting or programming or coding experience will ever be held against you as some kind of negative in your job searches, essentially. Okay. So let's go on with the other engine, of course, that is Unity. So the Unity game engine hasn't been around as long as the Unreal Engine, but it's quite good, and it's definitely improved quite a lot over the years. But it's basically going to be a particularly useful choice for game companies who are trying to make mobile titles, who are making casual titles, and for indies to make things, and of course for game jams and things like that. And Unity is going to be like a game engine for like sort of the rest of the world, but that actually ends up being a good close to half the, or more of the game market. So there's a lot of opportunities for being able to do stuff in Unity. It actually does now recently, fairly recently, has a visual scripting component into it, but it is not really ready for prime time. It's not ready for AAA, very high level quality work. It's definitely for like game jams and indie games and things like that. It does not work very efficiently at all. And it will be several years probably before it's really ready to be a very robust scripting solution along the lines of something like Blueprints. At the moment, it's just not there at all. So because of the fact that the visual scripting isn't really ready for prime time at this point in time, the most common skill that you're going to need to have in association with Unity is C# scripting capability. So you will need to learn how to script in C# inside Unity, basically. Now, there's lots of tutorials and there's lots of options to be able to learn C#, so this isn't really a huge, impossible task to deal with. And again, we're not asking to be huge high-level programmers, just people who can just look through the code and put a couple of lines in here or there, okay? So that's basically it. But understanding that logic flow is really, really, really key. And understanding how the game engine works and all the little parts and pieces of it, obviously very, very important because increasingly, game companies are using these existing game engines, Unreal and Unity, to make these kinds of games. So experience with these game engines is definitely going to be a significant plus. Okay, So that pretty much wraps it up as far as the big three that I would say that are super important. There are some other overlooked ones, but I'll probably do some other videos on some of those skills. They're not as highly in demand, but they are useful to know, comparatively speaking. Anyway, all right. We'll see you later in the next ones. And obviously, if you want to have more opportunities, hit that like button or the subscribe button or the notification bell to find out about our next videos. And we'll see you in the next one. Take care.